It's my pleasure to introduce to you one of the big supporters of arts education in New Jersey, and certainly one of the big supporters for the New Jersey Arts Education Partnership. He is the CEO and president of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation and a great friend of ours. Please welcome Mr. Chris Daggett.
Thanks, Bob, and good afternoon, everybody. So this is getting toward the end, so we've got to somehow make it lively enough, is that right, to entertain you at the same time here? The real purpose of this session is to hear from both Barry and Kimberly in just a minute. So I'm not going to take much time, but I just want to make 6 points. I think I can do that in a couple minutes, actually. The first is that I, of course, realize I'm in a room full of the converted and people who are already arts education advocates or converts. So I don't need to convince you of the importance and the power of a quality and consistent arts education. Dodge, like all of you, believes that arts learning is an important driver of critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration, which, of course, are all essential elements of preparing children to live and work in the 21st century. The second point is that Dodge is committed to ensuring that all children have access to these many benefits of the arts, so we invest in those districts where students aren't getting consistent arts programs. So we're committed to working with districts like Trenton, Newark, Camden, Patterson, and others to ensure that they all have strategic arts plans. Third point is that we need more funders who care about investing in New Jersey arts education to join Dodge and the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. We need more foundations like the Grunin Foundation, which is committed to reviving the New Jersey Teen Arts Festival. The fourth point, and this is related to actually all the last 3 points, are that none of these things that we do at Dodge, and we probably, I believe, outside the State Arts Council, we're the largest funder of the arts in New Jersey. But we can't do that without partners. And the first is the partnership we have with this New Jersey State Council on the Arts, with the Executive Director, Nick Paleologos, and the Chair, Elizabeth Matson. The State Council on the Arts truly, and as you all know, we're unique in this state, and there's not too many other states that have made a commitment to the arts the way New Jersey has financially over these many years. It's something that without that kind of commitment, we wouldn't even be able to do as much as we do in New Jersey. The second partnership is that we're also grateful for the New Jersey Arts Education Partnership, who of course are on the case here with the new Arts Ed Now campaign, which you've all seen and heard about. And with the strategic planning for districts, a model school program, and most importantly, their data collection that's needed to support the case for the need and to tell the stories of schools that recognize the importance of arts and that commit to protecting them. NJAEP has been a leader in the nation in statewide arts education data collection and interpretation, and I think, as we're all seeing in the argument about how to evaluate teaching and what's the best data to use. Data and data collection are very important, and it needs to be done right, and it needs to be done well, and it needs to be done grounded in good, I want to say science, but it's effectively, it's a combination, obviously, of some science and art, but there's no question that data is important. We're going through a bunch of that issue right now in Newark, trying to understand. As you know, there's a lot of controversy about changes that have occurred in Newark, and a lot of those fights, frankly, are over people fighting about data. How do you collect it? How do you interpret it? Then how do you, what kind of changes do you make as a result of it? So data is very important, and I think the respect that we've all got for Bob Morrison and the work of his staff has really been something that has underpinned a lot of the work and a lot of the progress we've made. So the partnership we have with NJAEP is terrific. And then finally, of course, we can't accomplish any of this without the partnership we have with the Department of Education. And with that, I want to bring up our two representatives. We have both Barry Ehrlichson, who is the Chief Performance Officer, and Kimberly Harrington, who's the Chief Academic Officer for NJDOE. And I am going to moderate some questions that we're going to ask them to respond to, none of which they've heard ahead of time. So we'll see how they respond. So thank you for being patient through the day and bearing with us and coming through to this last session. We really appreciate your attention on it. So I'm going to start with, actually for both of you, tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in the arts. What kind of your own personal experience with the arts, either with yourselves or your children, got you interested?
Okay, so all of the above. I pick all of the above. The arts have been a part of my life since infancy. My father was a dancer in New York City who then became a teacher, and we had music. He's a pianist and a choir director, and we've had music in our family forever. I have played classical flute for over 30 years. My sister plays the clarinet. Later, I danced my whole life, tap and ballet, and then a few years ago, somebody told me to start a bucket list and start doing the things on it now while I could enjoy them, and so I took them up on it, and I learned how to play the electric bass and joined a group and sing. And so that's something not many people know about me, but so those are hints for Kimberly. And I have two sons who are 18 and 12, and my 12-year-old plays the trumpet, and this year decided he wanted to learn to play the violin. And my 18-year-old is an Irish step dancer and plays the marimbas and is a photographer. So he started college this year and is studying event planning and coordination. And for all of us, music is our therapy, is our go-to. And my mom is not musical at all, but she will tell you that every musician needs an audience. So that's been her role for us our whole life. So
oh my God,
So Barry, can you top that?
I should have. I really should have. Am I on? Can anybody hear me? I should have gone first. Because, whoa, right? I am essentially tone deaf and can't carry a note and didn't play an instrument. I tried out for every instrument in the band when I was in 6th grade and couldn't get a single one of them to make a noise, period, and end of sentence. I love to sing, and in the 6th grade musical, I was given a non-verbal moment of being the top in Toyland. And so I am a convert to this. My children ultimately have brought me into this world. My daughter has a great ear, deconstructs chords amazingly, and she has really engaged me in the arts, thinking about the playing instruments. My children both are engaged in piano. My daughter obviously in voice and is now in an a cappella group and really enjoying it as part of Princeton High School.
So I should probably tell you that as fair is fair. I have no background in the arts. But with the exception of the fact that my parents both sang in choirs of one form or another for probably 60 years, mostly church choirs and glee club type things. And then my grandfather was the dean of engineering at one point at Rutgers back in the from 1929 to about 49, and wrote a number of the Rutgers songs that are played still today, fight songs and other things. So it's in my family, but I didn't get the gene. But I did work with Tom Kean when he was governor. I was deputy chief of staff initially, and I have to say, and then I unfortunately wasn't able to join you all this morning, but when you talked about being militant about the arts, I can tell you that you learned that when you worked for Tom Kean. And for me, the biggest moment in terms of appreciating it was in taking over Dodge. And it was one area that I hadn't had much of any experience in. And so I've been a little bit like a kid in a candy shop, seeing all the various arts activities across the state, but moved most, I think, by the Dodge Poetry Festival that every 2 years is done now in Newark, as you may know. So if you haven't been to the Poetry Festival yet, I'm going to make another pitch. that next year when it's back on again, you should go to it, because it's a pretty moving experience to see, particularly Student Day, when we get 4,000 kids from around the country to come to hear poets. So in any case, with that, I'm not going to answer any of the others. I'm going to put them all for you guys. So Kimberly, how do you view the arts' role in helping to achieve the state's overall education goals?
So clearly, I think the arts are incredibly important in achieving our goals. And I know one of the hot topics is about, in terms of our standards and the importance we have on the standards. And I think, in my opinion, the arts have often been left out or on the periphery of the conversations and need to become much more centralized. I feel like when we talk about a whole child, especially in intermediate and high school, where students really wrestle to figure out who they are and to take the skills they're learning and try to piece them together and make sense of them in the world that they live in, that is a critical area for them to have experiences outside of the reading, writing, math, science, and social studies classrooms that help them to really experience and connect the learning. And I think as I've assumed this role now for the past year, really starting to shift our conversations to make sure that we have all educators in the conversation, especially as we look at standards revision. And I feel like there are some missed opportunities, especially for the arts, as well as our other content area teachers who are responsible for the English language arts standards, but in a way that's very real and meaningful to their work. And I feel like many of our arts educators are real models and are exemplars of what this work looks like in the classroom as they help students to understand the history behind whatever art form they're studying, the connections, the language that's being spoken, whether it's musical or there's a lyrical piece behind it. And I think that we need to be extending out these conversations. But just saying that and bringing it back around the standards review work that's being done right now, it was critical to me that on that standards review committee, we had an arts educator who had a voice at the table.
And so how does it connect to the Common Core?
Well, we have the standards for 6 to 12 English language arts that have a component that attaches to our science, social studies, and technical subjects, which would include our arts educators. And I think that there's been this misunderstanding of that our science, social studies, and technical area teachers needed to become reading teachers in the context of the English teacher that many of us think of in our traditional sense. And I think that's not at all the intent of it, and that's where I see how our arts educators really are a lot of times the exemplars for what these literacy standards look like, because they've always helped their learners to understand the history and the written documentation that goes with whatever the media is that's being studied. And so I think that that's a real component of where the two fit together, is that we need to step out of the box of trying to put something into a box that it doesn't fit. And as my mom would always say, let's flatten the sides and take the lid off and make it a dance floor. So we can really think about how these standards play with each other and the role that we bring. Because when we help students to see how speaking and writing and listening, all of those components tied together across content areas, those are essential life skills regardless of career or occupation. And so I think that that's a way that it blends into the standards, and that we need to do a better job at the department of supporting educators in the other content areas, and especially in intermediate and secondary, where it's a lot harder when you're departmentalized to make those connections.
And Barry, how has the arts education census work influenced your own thinking on data and arts education?
Well, conducting a survey is very hard, and conducting an excellent survey is even harder. And I can tell you that under Bob's leadership, that the census that goes out every 5 years is phenomenal, and that they do a lot of work to guarantee a great response rate. I think and we're getting ready for our third census survey to be in the field in January. So I think that it's, data in and of itself is a very important first step to illuminating strengths and weaknesses and finding out trends and being able to take good hard looks at the moment in time that we're in and move forward. One of the things that it also illuminates is the need for different types of new and better data. And so we were really pleased to partner with Bob to put arts and visual and performing arts course taking information on our school performance reports. So in the past couple of years, at the high school level, we've looked at the count or the percentage of kids who are participating across all visual and performing arts, and then in the different subcategories of it. And we will be expanding that this year to the middle school so that we can look at the visual and performing arts course taking in the middle school.
I like your emphasis on we're about to go in the field with the next census. Which leads me to the question. That's right. Leads me to the question: is the census of enough value that essentially at some point the state should take that over or be involved in it? And I don't necessarily mean in the near term. I'm just talking about the ability to continue to do that, because Bob's work is based largely on a lot on foundation and other philanthropic support. But is it of enough value that the state should consider somehow being more deeply involved?
I think there's, I do think that the state could play that kind of role, but I also think there's a good role for a third party in the work. There's a sense of even though there's a partnership and we help them with the administration, there's, I think, a broader acceptance in some respects for the findings, because the data is not the department's data. There's data that the department does collect that can be triangulated with that kind of with the kind of data that's in the census. But in a world of transparency and perhaps skepticism, it's really great to have a third party committed to collecting that kind of information.
Well, and the point I made earlier about the difficulty with data, and everybody who looks at data has a different angle that they bring to it. There is something to be said, I think, for a third party, or at least having enough of a transparent process where you can give people comfort from a wide range of the political spectrum, if you will, that you're doing a good job. So, but I think it's something to explore, certainly, going forward. Let's shift over for a second to PARCC. So, Kimberly, what changes have been made to PARCC in response to the issues regarding the amount of test time required this past year? As you know, that was a big issue.
We're just going to do
punt that over to Barry?
pass along and let Barry start that one.
I'll let Barry start it.
So even coming out of the field test back in 2014, we knew then that we had some redundant points, particularly in reading, for our earliest testers. So even out of the field test, we were able to reduce the testing time for grades 3, 4, and 5 in language arts. And as we continued to study the results of the field test into the fall of 2014, we were able to see that we could, in fact, continue to reduce testing time. And so immediately after the administration in 2015, we announced changes to the test blueprint, which would allow us to collapse the test window into one window and ultimately reduce the test sessions and the amount of testing time, without sacrificing what are some of the core principles of PARCC, which is that we will test the grade level standards to the breadth and depth, so that we're able to give teachers and educators information at a standards level about how individual students are doing, so that it can be a tool that informs student learning. It's possible to have a much shorter test. It really is. And a lot of states have gone that direction with a lot less hoopla. But the commitment to being a test that informs student learning ultimately drives us to have a test that will yield reliable and valid information at a standards level, which is new to us. That's not what NJ-ASK was. It certainly wasn't what HESPA was. But it's a new proposition for us to have a statewide assessment system that contributes to student learning in that way.
And did you want to comment at all on that question?
Just that having been in the classroom, I was a teacher for 16 years and then an administrator before I came to the department. And during NJ-ASK was often frustrated because I didn't get to see what the writing, what a writing sample look like, and would get back data that was difficult for me to actualize change in the classroom. So I'm excited that we have a test now that doesn't sample the standards, that it assesses all the standards, and that we're going to get back data that I can actually use with my team to help guide the supports that we give, whether they're resources or in-person or online supports around where we see there's a need for assistance, and to be able to actually dig in specifically instead of in generality. So,
I mean, to understand this even further, right, in addition to sampling the standards, which meant that sometimes the geometry cluster would have been harder in one year versus the next year because of just the part of the standards that were sampled. Like, and understand what that did to educators who actually were trying to be longitudinal about that. Like, oh, what did we do this year? Our cluster score is but what did we not, and the crapshoot that created for teachers about, did I teach what's being tested this year? I mean, in JASC and HESPA, we also didn't release any test questions, ever. So teachers never saw what it was that we expected students to demonstrate in terms of their learning, in terms of what it was that they knew and were able to do. We were never able to have learning conversations around exemplar student work. So it's a huge step forward for us. October 23rd is the date that PARCC will release a full test in all the grade levels and the subject areas with graded student work, annotated by the scores, with the rubrics, and the whole conversation about what it means for students to demonstrate their learning is going to shift in New Jersey as a result.
And let's hope that the impact, as you know, there was pretty heavy impact, I think, on arts classes, among others, not just arts classes, but certainly among others, in that focus on the park. And part of that was, and you've spoken about that before, and you and I have spoken about this before, but the idea that people felt they had to teach to the test. Speak to that a little bit, would you? Because teaching to the test, first of all, I don't think it was as necessary as people thought it was. But if you could just comment on that.
The Common Core mentions the arts 75 times, right? One of my favorite conversations with the superintendent after the administration of the PARCC assessment was that he came up and he said to me, you know what? We've never watched the video of a performance and thought about it critically. We watch movies and videos of the play when we finish the unit as a way to celebrate the unit, right? Celebrate that we finished the unit. But yet in the PARCC assessment in language arts, there was a video of a performance. And students were asked to think critically of the video of the performance as an interpretation of the text. Right? So the PARCC assessment itself is trying to emulate the instruction that we hope to see, which in fact includes arts. I mean, Kimberly sort of led us to this point, but visual and performing arts teachers made the instructional shifts to the Common Core that we've been like decades ago. Asking students to think critically about something, to make an argument, support why they believe it, that is that instruction that they've had in their classroom decades ago. And so we have yet to fully utilize those educators as the resources for those instructional shifts that we should have. But they are, in fact, really, really important parts of these types of conversations.
Can I just add on? I just wanted to add on that I think we have, and I say we because I was definitely a part of it when I was still in district, but for years and years we've had a culture that has taught to a test. And it's very difficult. It's difficult. Change is hard. We all know that. But to really change a mindset, and I think that's one of the things that really sets the PARCC assessment, off on its own, because it's focused on all standards. And so, the best thing you can do to prepare for this assessment is to just have good classroom practice every day that's aligned to the standards, and authentic learning experiences for children where they have those opportunities to think critically and to argue and debate and to express their ideas. And I always say to my own children, I want their voices to be heard. And I think that's one of the gifts of the Common Core, is that we're helping kids to not just say, what's your opinion, but why, what substantiates it. And I always say to my own kids, get your posse behind you. You know, I want to hear your opinion. People want to hear what you have to say, but you need to have the evidence and the research and the documentation that supports it. And so, you know, I think that that's a game changer for us, but a very hard shift to make when we've, for years and years and years, taught to the test or taken a time out from learning to get ready for a test. But when we take a time out from learning here, this is detrimental because it's a day-to-day immersion in the work and the learning that's what's going to make us successful.
Well, as I heard one superintendent say, if I could get my teachers to teach to the test, that would be the best thing I could possibly do with respect to this, to the park, because of what it does in terms of the day-to-day thinking about it. Let's shift from this to STEM to STEAM. There's a growing movement in that regard. I have to say, from almost the beginning of the time that I was at Dodge, Wendy Lisko, our education program director, has been talking about STEAM, not STEM. I could never get her to just talk about STEM. And so, and as I mentioned about my grandfather was an electrical engineer, and he loved music and was deeply involved in music, as often happens, it seems, with people in the sciences. So speak a little bit about how we start to infuse the arts into STEM. I usually use the example of pulling out my phone, my iPhone or my iPad, and saying the amount of creativity that goes into this, the amount of artwork, the amount of design, is indicative of the fact that you got to marry the two. So if you could speak to it from the standpoint of the Common Core and from the work that you're doing on curriculum.
So before I answer this, I always believe in disclosing your biases to the audience. So I just want to let you know that this is a really passionate subject for me. So you can give me the like cutoff sign or whatever. I think one of the biggest things that we do to change the conversation from STEM to STEAM is stop using them synonymously, because there's an A that's missing in STEM. And so until we start referring to it as STEAM and we're always including the A that draws the attention to it. Thank you. I think that's the game changer. My dad, my parents are both drug and alcoholism counselors now, but before they went into that line of work, my dad taught math and music simultaneously. And people would say, that's weird, why do you teach those two subjects? And my dad would say, you can't separate the two, they go hand in hand in the learning. And so, you know, when we're thinking about all these careers, many of which don't exist yet, that tomorrow's children will become the owners of, we need to make sure that they're prepared. And as you said, you can't separate the two. You can't separate the design. You can't separate the math and the science. And you know, while I do think that our arts educators have been that go-to and that look for the ELA standards, I think in many instances have also been a look to in the science and the mathematics. And I'm actually sorry, I mean, I'm happy for you that those aren't a part of sort of another thing on your plate. But again, I feel like that's a very natural infusion of content areas that is often not recognized how deeply that goes, and not in just the music world, but in the arts and in the composition and dance and poetry, all of that involves rhythm and interaction in our world and the way that emotions come into play with learning. So at the department, actually, that's one thing that we're looking at right now, not even looking at. I've pulled together a group, and not just in my own division, but across divisions, because we all need to be thinking about that, how this works together and how this changes the way that courses are set up, the way that they interplay. And so we've put together a group internally to begin developing out a STEAM initiative. I know that New Jersey School Boards Association is a huge supporter as well, and a tremendous partner to us. But you all are critical in this conversation. And so again, just like the Standards Review Committee, we can't have this conversation about STEAM without having your membership present at the table also.
So in that spirit, talk a little bit about the changes in revision to the art standards. And importantly, you know, we tend to silo these things. So there's standards in arts, there's standards in math, there's standards in science. How do we begin to think about standards that cross over and bring the two together in some fashion?
You're in my mind, because this is actually a conversation I just brought up with my leadership team last week, is the need to really dig deeply into that question about how do we cross standards and infuse this work. And As many of you know, the art standards are in a review process. I don't know if Dale spoke to that this morning. He's saying no, he didn't. And so I know he's in the stages, the planning stages, and getting ready to pull together a group to begin looking at the revision of the standards and how we make them New Jersey specific. Do we adopt them, as they are nationally? Do we bring them in and make them New Jersey specific? But I think the steps that have been taken so far, I think, to infuse this work is to break down the siloing. So I'm a huge believer that whatever I'm asking you in the field to do, I need to mirror that at the department. So I would just back it up to say that as we look at how do we break down the silos and stop looking at standards in each specific content area, as many of you know, at the department, we've been organized in my division, which was the Division of Academics, and it's now the Division of Teaching and Learning. We've been organized around content areas, and content is important, but it can't be removed from the children whom we deliver it to. And so while Dale is your go-to for the arts, he will continue to be that, but we're hoping to actually help him to be able to dig in deep in areas and get him some support. And so what we're doing is I reorganized around the way that we teach in schools. So we have a Division of Early Childhood, we have an Office of Primary Education, and intermediate and secondary education, so that we can be really thinking about the issues that those particular children face. But because we're doing that and having the content areas not all the ELA people sit together and all the math people sit together and have their conversations about their content area, which is important, that needs to permeate, especially if we're going to begin to talk about how standards can look differently if we cross them and help them to be infused into children who go through a day not being a science student or a math student, but being a student trying to collect skills and make sense of them in the world around them. So we have the content folks dispersed among those teams so that the conversations are rich and then vertically articulated as well.
That's great. And Barry, if you would, related to that, talk a little bit, you mentioned it earlier, but what was the thinking behind including arts education in the school performance reports?
I mean, I just need to give credit where credit is due. Bob. We were looking for ways to continue to have our performance reports be reflective of the important work that school districts do, of everything that schools do, everything that we could realistically measure well at the state level without an incredible undue burden to schools in terms of their data reporting. It's very, very hard to do that well at the state. Lots of people have great ideas of what could be collected, what should be collected, but when you try to balance it against what are school districts trying to do in their daily work and how much energy and time does it take to collect data really, really well, you end up with oftentimes not being able to do the kinds of collections that you want to do. But many of you will remember the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund Act from the federal government back in 2009, which mandated that as a state we start collecting transcript data. So what students were actually taking, what was on a student's transcript. So we had started collecting at a course level the membership in teachers for every course in every school district in the state. It was a long road of implementing common course codes across the state so that everyone was reporting the same class in Algebra 1 in the middle school versus pre-algebra. And Bob shows up and says, I know how to map all of those course codes that you've just implemented to visual and performing arts. And so we did it. I mean, of all the things that I've had to do at the State Department, or I've chosen to do at the State Department, this was a no-brainer. It was simple, it was precise, it was data that we were already collecting, and ultimately it gives the well-rounded picture of our high schools that we knew existed. And what it showed, so in New Jersey, students are required to take 5 credits of visual and performing arts to get the regular diploma. And what we showed is that children are taking twice as much as they have to. And that was a phenomenal outcome. Now, why every other state doesn't do this, I think it's because Bob doesn't live there.
But it's also, isn't it related to the fact that it would be good if we had, as part of college entrance requirements, a greater focus on arts? Because if it was, then it would translate back down into the K-12 level, and you'd see more people focused on it. So I think it's all these pieces are
Yep, all
parts of a
pieces come
puzzle,
together.
if you
No,
will.
without a, I mean, we have 5 credits requirements. Students are taking 10. I have to believe that to some degree they're reading the messages of post-secondary institutions about its importance. But ultimately, every state gets to define what is a diploma. And in New Jersey, that's been the way that it's been defined so far.
And I just want to piggyback on that because part of the reorganization idea, and when you have one person who's responsible for an enormous amount of arts education, when you think about how do you best utilize those talents, one of my greatest concern are for our secondary students, especially those with interest in dance or theater, or perhaps those who weren't exposed so didn't know they had that interest until later. And so how do we really dig deep, and how do we look at this cross connection to higher ed, which is why I have seated Dale on our intermediate and secondary teams. And that's not to say that elementary or primary and early education, arts education aren't important, because they're critical. That's where the foundation starts. But I think we do a better job of that in the elementary schools. And I think that when we think about how do we catch these kids before they either miss the opportunity or haven't been given what they need to follow the career pathway that they're interested in, there's a real need for those conversations, and Dale has a tremendous gift and talent for that. And so that's where I want him to be able to focus as a priority right now as we look to figure out how do we bridge this gap.
So, Bob, if I don't know if you do this before, but is it appropriate to ask if there are any questions that we haven't covered that somebody might? Oh, Bob's saying not appropriate. Okay, with that, I think it's clear that if anybody had any doubts about the importance of arts education to the key people who are influencing and otherwise making decisions that affect education in the state of New Jersey, I think you should be comforted in both Kimberly and Barry and the work they're doing and the commitment they bring to the arts. So please, if you would, join me in thanking them both for doing this today.
Thank you.